Ladies and gentlemen, dear participants, good afternoon or good evening, depending from where you are joining us today. And please allow me to introduce myself. My name is Cynthia Nyasimbe Sonam. I will be moderating this panel organized by the Africa Economic Zones Organization with the help of the African Union as part of the celebration of the African Integration Day. I'm the Secretary General of Togo Invest Corporation, which is also a member of the Africa Economic Zone Organization. And as you are all aware, this panel aims to discuss the role of economic zones in supporting African trade and business integration. And it is a great honor to have with us today His Excellency the Ambassador, Mr. Albert Muchanga, to whom I will now give the floor for his opening remarks. Mr. Albert Muchanga, Your Excellency, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, moderator. I'm very happy to be with you and all the participants in this panel discussion. And I'll begin by saying that business is at the heart of the African continental free trade area, because you are going to be the drivers, the market players. And in this market, there is a very massive opening, lots of opportunities, if I can emphasize. The African continental free trade area is a market of 1.2 billion people. And this makes it the third biggest market compared to China and India. And in this market of such a huge magnitude, the reality on the ground is that there is a very large supply vacuum. And the special economic zones can occupy this space by producing for this large market with a market that has very huge growth potential. For this to be realized, a number of activities will be undertaken, and I'm going to touch on a few of those activities. First and foremost, special economic zones can use the opportunity offered by the African continental free trade area to trigger economic policy reforms focused on accelerate the diversification at the production and export levels. You are the agents that will accelerate intra-African trade in value-added products, including personal protective equipment and other medical supplies required the current COVID-19 pandemic. Secondly, you need to participate in the ongoing consultations that are focused on developing regulations to facilitate intra-African trade for products from special economic zones. The draft regulations will be considered by the upcoming meetings of the African Continental Free Trade Area Negotiation Forum that is going to start on the 14th of this month. I call on your organization to take part in the development of these guidelines by liaising with your respective national delegations to make inputs. As part of your inputs, I invite you to build on your agreement that the development of special economic zones should, where possible and practical, cut across national boundaries so that these arrangements facilitate the development of regional special economic zones. This is fully in line with the program of developing regional value and supply chains, as well as the vision of creating one African market. From the foregoing, I urge you to ensure that this important issue is adequately covered in the regulations that will facilitate products from the special economic zones to be traded under the African Continental Free Trade Area. Thirdly, you need to mobilize investments. A large market of 1.2 billion people demands equally large-scale investments. Mobilize partners with a message that Africa is the next growth venture with a young population and an integrating market offering high returns with reasonable risk. Fourthly, industrialization in Africa will grow on the back of a skilled labor force. To achieve this requires strategic collaboration among governments, academia, and the private sector to invest in the evolution of establishments dedicated to research and development, industrial design, as well as manufacturing and agro-processing institutes, offering specialized training to the workforce of the manufacturing and agro-processing factories, including those in the special economic zones. The fifth point I would like to make under this section is that governments, academia, and the private sector, including those in special economic zones, as part of their strategic positioning, should position Africa to leverage the digital economy and the fourth industrial revolution in order to be well placed to leapfrog the process of sustainable development. As African Union Commission, we include this issue for discussion in the upcoming African Union Summit on Industrialization and Economic Diversification, which is scheduled to be held in Niamey, Niger in November this year. The sixth and last point that I would like to make under this section is that the African special economic zones have, under the post-COVID-19 era, the potential of tapping into warehousing and logistics to create competitive trading infrastructure by, among others, harnessing single window clearance to facilitate efficient movement of goods across Africa. Your input in this direction is to lobby governments to build secure and well-placed physical infrastructure, including roads, rail, energy, and telecommunications that could open new markets across Africa in line with the vision of creating one African market under the African Continental Free Trade Area. Against the background of these points, I foresee increasing support from the governments and local authorities for special economic zones. In this connection, there should be enhanced promotion of investments in the special economic zones by introducing new incentives to attract new investments. These may include ensuring that special economic zones are safe from a health perspective, as well as enhancing new methods of digital transactions in all commercial activities. I'll conclude as I started. You are a big market. Rather, not that we have before you a very big market. And the really challenge that you have before you now is to say, how can we leverage investments large enough to ensure that we supply a market of 1.27 billion people? If you fail to reach this market, your market share is going to go down, and of course, you lose competitiveness. So with this, I think you can deliberate on how special economic zones can mobilize investments large enough for them to be able to significantly supply this large market of 1.27 billion people. Thank you very much for attention, and I'll stop my remarks here and look forward to really a very active participation. But after the opening ceremony, let me be excused because I have other panel discussions tomorrow and I need to prepare for those. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Your Excellency, for this keynote remarks, for this opening speech, which really urged all the, let's say, African business actors to come together and play a role in this agenda that we are all pursuing, which is Africa integration and the development of intra-Africa trades. You have clearly observed and highlighted that special economic zones or African economic zones are a key player. They are a strong shareholder in this challenge, and that we have to obviously work on policy levels and attract a lot of investment to be able to tap into this huge market, which is that we have in Africa. So thank you again for your for the time, and with that we can continue. Thank you very much, Your Excellency. So following the introduction of the ambassador, I will now give the floor to the Secretary General of the Africa Economic Zone Organization, and that's Mr. Ahmed Benis, who is the Secretary General of the AEZO. AEZO is an association which gathers economic zones and development partners in, let's say, institution in charge of the development and management of economic zones in Africa. Today, as of today, the AEZO counts around 80 members representing 45 countries in Africa. So this is quite a strong organization that we have today representing the economic zones in Africa. And Mr. Ahmed, Benis, I will now give you the floor for you to give us your introductory notes. Thank you.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you, Excellency, for this outstanding opening remarks. Dear participants and experts, dear members of Africa Economic Zones Organization, dear partners, good afternoon to all of you, or good evening. I'm delighted to celebrate today the first edition of the Africa Integration Day, and very pleased to open together with His Excellency this virtual meeting under the theme of the role of economic zones in supporting African trade and business integration. Economic zones, as you know, were adopted relatively late in Africa, and most African countries did not execute their programs till late 90s. As of today, there are more than 189 operating economic zones in the continent, and 57 projects has been announced for completion. But since its inception, economic zones has given a significant boost to FDI flows and created an attractive investment conditions and of course support job creation. Over the last 5 years, 60 million jobs have been created in agro-processing, industrial fields and services. Economic zones have also led to export diversification, promoting regional trade and stimulating industrial spillover effect and clustering. One of the most prominent features of the global trading landscape in the recent years has been the worldwide proliferation of bilateral and regional trade agreements. And Africa is no exception to this matter. And African governments have embarked on various regional integration processes with the aim of opening up regional markets and creating new opportunities for intra-regional trade and industrial development of on the continent. In this sense, we are entitled to develop new processes for the supply chain, supporting the vision of creating one single African market under the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. That stands for making a significant contribution to reducing trade transaction costs and to facilitate cross-border trade. It also aims to boost intra-African trade, enhancing the continent's global trade performance and supporting regional and continental value chain, contributing to the expansion and diversification of the continent's productive capacity. Indeed, in the African context and within the CFTA, economic zones have proven to be the trigger for the development of regional industrial policy and could be definitely considered as an important platform for scaling up production and export, boosting intra-regional trade, and promoting greater competitiveness for manufacturing industry. We are confident that economic zones can help rethinking the economic model to be developed in the continent, and strongly believe that we should rely on our resources, generate internal growth, and transform our raw materials produced locally and develop the regional value chain complementarity between countries. Economic zones, as His Excellency said earlier, play a key role in improving regional network of production and trade by enhancing the country's productive and distributive capacity and enabling cross-border cooperation among public and private stakeholders. It also, the economic zones must undertake continuous technological and industrial learning, innovation, and upgrading. The objective here is to enhance the productivity and sustain long-term competitiveness. So it's so important for economic zones to catalyze and facilitate industrial upgrading by promoting technology innovation transfer and highly valued activity sector to be targeted toward different development stage. And in this framework, our organization, so the Africa Economic Zones Organization, has developed a new concept called Smart Economic Zones. It consists on a B2B online platform. It will be deployed by end of this year. And this B2B platform is designed for the companies located in the zone that will connect this ecosystem. I'm the member of this ecosystem, connecting local authorities, the administrations, custom administration, freight forwarders, transport companies, and of course the companies themselves, and this under the umbrella of the economic zones organizations. This could be extended of course to cross-border cooperations, project collaborations, resources sharing, and communication between the AEZO community members. So in that sense, we have identified many benefits through this project. First of all, is aligning the business development and sourcing goals and objectives through the collaboration between the economic zones ecosystems. Sustainability is also one of the key objectives through the development of new policies with respect to sustainable development goals and encouraging and a responsible management of the zones. Inclusiveness. The platform would serve the needs of local firms and entrepreneurship and connects them with more goal players. And this is one of the objectives. And of course, it goes also with encouraging zones to develop linkage and connection with regional economies, serving as a catalyst in order to, let's say, allow isolated regions that can become part of a global networks of business. It will also help to enhance or to develop or to implement strong collaborations with local and international university. And this is something that we miss already today. With universities and experts in order to enhance the knowledge sharing and the capacity building. Innovation and knowledge development would be one of the drivers, promoting digitizations of processes within the zones. And the COVID-19 crisis demonstrated that digitization is one of the main concerns today, and with the aim to facilitate operations and increase the competitiveness of the zones and the companies located in. So promoting the Made in Africa by Africans is one of our targets through the collaborations and cooperations and cross-border integrations between economic zones and also the entrepreneurs. So we all agree that regional trade and regional integrations expand markets and trade, enhance cooperations, mitigate risk, foster socio-cultural cooperation and regional stability. But we have the responsibility as the main operators to look forward and seize the opportunity of the African Continental Free Trade Agreement. So regional integration aims also to stimulate development by improving productive capacity and encouraging investment in those pieces of infrastructures called economic zones that will hold the most economic potentials. My last word is economic zones today holds a tremendous promise for the Africa regional integrations. I wish you a lot of success for these webinars and stay tuned with the next panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ahmed Benis, Secretary General of the Africa Economic Zone Organization. Thank you. I believe that with the keynote remarks of His Excellency and your introductory speech, we have the framework that will set the discussion of our panel today. And I will just tell you that we have put together just a nice panel, very interesting with well-renowned experts to discuss this issue about special economic zones and how they can support intra-Africa trade and business integration in Africa. And I will now, without further ado, go and introduce them. But before I do that, I will just encourage all the participants, and I see we have nearly 100 participants following us today. I will encourage them to take part in the discussion by either posting a comment in the comment window or posting a question in the Q&A window that is on the screen. And we will have maybe around 60 to 70 minutes of discussion, following what I will do my best to take all your questions, pose them to the panelists, and hopefully with your contribution and the contribution of the panelists, we will be able to have a fruitful and very rich discussion. So going straight into the panelists, I will first introduce the first panelist, who is Dr. Gokan Akinci. Dr. Gokan Akinci is a technical lead at the World Bank Group, specifically at the IFC department. He's a leading global expert on spatial growth initiatives, such as special economic zones, and he has been advising governments in the design and implementation of complex growth, competitiveness, and economic zones initiatives for more than 20 years now. Welcome, Dr. Gokan Akinci. Next, we have Dr. Mena Hassan. Dr. Mena Hassan is a legal and economic affairs officer in the Ascensions Division of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. She has extensive experience on trade policy analysis, trade facilitation, and trade and development. Very nice to have Dr. Mena with us this afternoon. Third on the list, we have Mr. Paul Hansen. Mr. Paul Hansen is chief at Trade Facilitation Section in the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, UNCTAD, precisely in the division on technology and logistics. And Paul has also extensive experience in the area of trade and transport facilitation. The fourth panelist is Ms. Terfa Ashwe. Ms. Terfa Ashwe is a consultant at the International Trade Center. She is a lawyer and specializing in international trade law and governance, with also extensive experience on trade and development, regional integration, business competitiveness, and so on. So very nice to have her also on this panel. Then we have Mr. Michael Schmitz. Mr. Michael Schmitz is a senior expert at the UNIDO, precisely in the Investment and Technology Promotion Office in Germany. Mr. Schmidt had 20 years experience, more than 20 years experience in international business, investment management, and trade and development, with a focus on Eastern Europe, China, and African markets. Last but not least, we have Mr. Jean-Marc Kilolo. Mr. Jean-Marc Kilolo is an economist based at the Sub-Regional Bureau for Central Africa for the United Nations Economic Commission for Africa, and he works on issues relating to economic diversifications. Ladies and gentlemen, once again, thank you for being with us. Thank you for your availability. So going straight in the debate, I believe that the two speakers at the beginning have set the pace. We have economic zones that are proliferating in many transition and emerging economies, the advantages of economic zones in terms of job creations, in terms of diversifying the economies, promoting FDIs and so on. We can name them, and you know, there are lots of advantages. And when we look at the economic benefit that these zones have induced in some countries, and the opportunities that that lie in regard to the global economic context that His Excellency has spoken about, and also Mr. Ahmed, it is not wrong to assert that when they are well designed and well implemented, special economic zones can definitely lead to a structural economic change and can significantly contribute to the Africa integration agenda. So with that said, I want to direct my first question to Dr. Gokan Akinci. Dr. Gokan Akinci, you are a leading expert, global expert on special economic zones. And we talk about SEZ economic zones, but I would like you just to, again, give a general picture of what we are talking about, to tell us what is your take on what do we mean by special economic zones first? What is the framework of those zones? And how does these zones can be used to enable intra-regional trade? Please, Dr. Gokan Akinci.
Thank you, Cynthia. Thank you. And hi, everybody. It's a pleasure to be part of this discussion. And also thank you, Ambassador Albert, and also Ahmed, for your intros I'm going to try to take a step back a little bit and show a few slides also to really help all of us to open our minds to the model, because what we need to really understand is, especially when we are discussing trade agreements, regional blocks, it's important to really figure out and agree on what the model we are talking about is. Because in many minds, there are different shapes and sizes of economic zones. Many of us think about the concrete block with fences around it, producing apparel. Some of us have very large concepts of AEZOs in our minds. I think we need to really agree on the flexibility of the model. What are the components and ecosystem that we need to think is critical before we think about and discuss the contribution of this model to regional trade and investment, and also bringing the topic into discussions on regional trade agreements. So in that sense, I'll just basically present or bring a couple of slides basically into the discussion. Let's see. I just want to make sure, can you see now?
Yes.
A slide?
Yeah.
Excellent.
Fine.
So I wanted to actually go through just a few slides very quickly, not hold the discussion. One is some lessons are learned from what I call in general industrial infrastructure initiatives 1.0 and 2.0. 1.0 model is the EPZ export processing model, which was pretty rigid. And then 2.0 is the shift towards the SEZ model. And I think I consider we have a 3.0, which is more of a flexible industrial infrastructure ecosystem model. But what we learned from the first two models is actually that there is a need to develop a clear vision and objectives for these industrial infrastructure initiatives that are linked to the industrialization strategy of the country, and in many cases to the regional strategies, and agree on a modern vision and a flexible model that can be utilized in different shapes and sizes within a country or within a region. And this is really very important so that the discussions we have on regional trade agreements or in investment is actually flexible enough to what is coming up in the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years, rather than looking back and stick with a model that has partially worked and partially have not worked. And the second is actually changing our mindset from provision of incentives to investor servicing, and even to basically currently very important responding to crisis and supporting sectors, developing clusters that are sustainable and resilient to basically crisis, as well as in line with ongoing trends and changes in the market. And this requires actually not just the hard infrastructure, but more so the ecosystem of soft infrastructure that we need to pull together. And these soft infrastructure and institutional capacity and coordination is usually what makes or breaks these initiatives. Thirdly, initiatives that are really focused on market demand and understanding of specific sectors and their vitality and the issues they are facing, and addressing those regulatory, institutional, and policy barriers they are facing has been the more successful ones. And one process that actually needs to be very important is this is a dynamic process that is multi-sector, multi-institutional, and multi-year. So when we start the SEZ initiatives, it's really important to think that we are going into a long haul that requires doing some serious homework and building on that homework that starts with a vision and an implementation strategy so that we increase the success of these initiatives. SEZs in general, or the industrial infrastructure, provide an opportunity because they work between the economy-wide macro basically reforms, firm level approaches in that metro space that can help unlock value chain potentials, cluster potential, and help develop ecosystems that bind these two different levels of basically economic and firm level reforms into each other to form those necessary clusters. And in doing these initiatives and binding those different levels, we need to really think about what's happening globally and regionally. What are the trends shaping opportunities and challenges for in the future? We can look at, the changes in China's structural formation. What kind of investments are moving out of China? What's the meaning of basically, what's the impact of the end of super commodity cycle for our initiatives? The value chains are changing, the way they operate are changing, and the COVID-19 will have an impact on this in terms of the way some of these global value chains work, regionalize, maybe near shore. We need to really also understand that in designing our work on trade investment agreements as well as AEZOs. Urbanization is basically increasing. City competitiveness has become an important topic. There's a growing middle class. What does that mean for us in designing these initiatives? And climate change. So being eco-industrial park, eco-zones is not really an add-on anymore. This is really critical. And when I do this, when I talk about green, it's not just addressing climate change, but being really economically and socially sustainable and effective is critical. And we need to also think about disruptive technologies, Industry 4.0, changing shape of industries, and what does it mean in the way we design economic zones to accommodate these future changes. And another one is, for example, increased need to focus on skills. Do we have the right type of skills for industries changing from A to Z, and not only thinking about manufacturing, but combination of manufacturing services, which is becoming more and more important. With that said, when we look at the 3.0 industrial infrastructure, these initiatives are basically more programmatic, and they look at coordinating across different government and private sector actors. We are not only looking at basically hard infrastructure at a location, but we are looking at how do we bring together a concerted and effective combination of different improved policies, laws, regulations, and institutions in land, urban planning, utilities, climate, social and environmental sustainability, skills, linkages, trade, and many other initiatives, including investment, basically generation, to develop the right basis to enhance competitiveness of an area to attract the right type of sectors where the country has competitive and comparative advantages. And in that, I just want to actually highlight one area. I mean, if you look at basically one component that we want to embed, for example, low carbon growth and environmental and social excellence in our basically framework, when we look at how do we do this, we notice that it has implications on a number of things that we need to think about on how do we set up the right type of PPPs, how do we master plan, what are the critical institutional capacity and coordination issues between the agencies and ministries that we are going to be involved in. So this is actually a very complex area that we need to think about and do our homework. And we need to bring that thinking when we are discussing trade agreements, trade arrangements regionally, to ensure that we are also thinking at the necessary depth we should be to enable the zones to become what they can be as areas of excellence to support trade and industrial growth in the countries and in the region in general. This is just to basically reflect the complexity of the initiatives in general on industrial infrastructure, to say that we have to really think about that complexity and not look at this issue in a very simplistic manner when we are discussing regional trade and investment agreements. In doing so at the national and regional level, we need to ask a number of questions. These are just sample questions. But what do we want to achieve at the national and regional level when we design in the industrial infrastructure initiatives? So we can actually use them as components of that strategy to be effective and support that strategy to the best they can. What value chains have provided opportunity and challenged the most in line with changing global and regional trends and impact of, for example, COVID-19, which is an important agenda, I think, for the next couple of years for us. What are the key market challenges and opportunities industrial infrastructure will be utilizing and basically responding to? And what are the failures we need to address in the ecosystem? And when we look at the ecosystem, which ones are a bit more important? What are the soft economic tools that will help address those particular market failures? And if we look at that ecosystem again, how do we maximize the relevant institutional capacity and coordination among different agencies so that they all commit to and effectively implement the necessary ecosystem environment. How do we look at innovation mechanisms? How do we look at local communities so that they actually feel part of, and they are part of, the initiatives from a physical planning, healthcare, social, gender, and economic growth perspective? How do we maximize transfer of skills between investments and the local economy? Management know-how and technology are similar. And how do we look at disruptive trends and technologies that are affecting or going to be affecting our national and regional economy in the next 5, 10, 15 years, so we can actually start preparing for those around this ecosystem initiatives. I'm going to actually stop here, and then, okay. I'm not sure if you can see me back now. I'll stop here. I wanted to provide this perspective to open our minds that we are not talking about a pretty simple, basically, initiative. These are really complex initiatives. And if you want them to be successful and productive in the medium and long term, we need to understand that complexity and include it in our discussions and in our strategies so that we can be effective, not just for now, but for the next decade or two for the African economies, and also use the regional agreements and discussions to make sure we address the issues in a proper and complex fashion as they are. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gokan Akinci. Thank you for these interesting issues that you have brought together in such a short time, but there was a lot to take in. What we can take out is that establishing economic zone is a very complex initiative. And when we look at the context now, we have to really develop these zones or design them by taking into account a lot of factors. And we're now moving from industry or economic zones 1.0 to 2.0, 3.0. And today we need to take into account the fact that to be able to have economic zones that are very, or less sustainable and can generate the outcomes that we expect them to do, we have to pair together the soft infrastructure and the hard infrastructure. And the soft infrastructure part is what is very interesting. I mean, that whole ecosystem that needs to be put together. That's you mentioned the policies, you mentioned land, you mentioned the contribution of the local communities, you mentioned skills, you mentioned the disruptive technologies that are also coming up, the crisis that we have to also face in between. So all this really show that it's a complex initiative that's which is to when we look at special economic zones, and it's very interesting because it helps us really move forward. And I'm happy to say that at the Africa Economic Zone Organization, for instance, capacity building and experience sharing is very an important factor of the association. So these inputs will definitely help move the discussion and the debate further, and hopefully we will be able to attain our objectives. I would like to stay on the soft infrastructure side, and I know that when we talk about intra-Africa trade, we cannot talk about intra-Africa trade without looking at how goods are moved between countries across borders. And one thing is to properly implement and establish the zones, which will produce goods. But another thing is to make sure that there is the right environment for the movement of goods. And here I would like to call Dr. Mena Hassan, who's the expert from WTO, and really ask her to tell us about the trade facilitation agreement of the WTO. As of today, what is the status in terms of implementation of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement? And from your perspective, from your point of view, what do you see what is the importance of this Trade Facilitation Agreement for Africa in the agenda, in the integration perspective that we are all looking at? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you, Ambassador and Ahmed. Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to thank the African Economic Zones Organization for inviting me to speak on the special occasion and to also congratulate all Africans for Africa Integration Day. A large part of Africa's future economic development will be determined by how much Africans can trade with one another, whether on the regional level or on the continent. As you know, since 1995, the World Trade Organization has been governing international trade rules by making them more transparent and predictable for its 164 members. Now, there are in the special economic zones in the WTO are not regulated per se. Having said this, there are a few agreements which touch on the different measures that governments, when they undertake in the context of special economic zones. Now, these measures, depending on what kind of measures, would be regulated under the WTO. So just quickly, we have two such agreements. First, the one on subsidies and countervailing measures. So any export subsidies or subsidies that are contingent on the use of domestic goods over imported goods in special economic zones, those would be prohibited. But for example, when we have general infrastructure that is made available to both local and foreign companies, those would not be prohibited. Secondly, the WTO agreement on trade-related investment measures, the TRIMS agreement, it does not mention special economic zones again, but there are specific measures such as local content requirements that would restrict, which would restrict imports to favor the use of domestic inputs. And these would be prohibited under the TRIMS agreement. Now, thirdly, and the focus of our discussion is the newest WTO agreement, and that's the Trade Facilitation Agreement. I want to highlight two reasons, first, why this is a special and unique agreement in the context of the World Trade Organization. First of all, the TFA is the only multilateral agreement since the establishment of the WTO in 1995. If there's one big achievement of the Doha Development Round, if you've heard of it, it is the TFA, the Trade Facilitation Agreement. It took almost 10 years to negotiate and was hailed a success at the WTO's 9th Ministerial Conference in 2013 and entered into force in 2017. Now, what makes this agreement special vis-a-vis previous WTO agreements is that as opposed to them, the TFA gives unique flexibilities to developing countries and least developing countries in the implementation of their obligations. These are self-designated commitments that each country can choose which measures it can implement and when it can implement them. So for measures that a country believes it can implement straight away upon entry into force of the agreement, these would fall under Category A commitments. And then measures which would require more time fall under Category B. And finally, those which require technical assistance and capacity building fall under Category C. But what's important is at the end of the day, and even if it's a very long day, that all measures are implemented by all the countries. Now, as you all know, trade facilitation regulates behind the border measures. So those which aim to lower transaction costs or trade costs, such as red tape, cumbersome customs procedures, excessive fees and formalities, etc. Now, again, in the WTO context and in the TFA, it focuses on, let's say, three broad areas of measures. The first are those that are transparency related. So whether it's publication, for example, of trade rules, regulations, of import and export procedures, this would be the first area. The second relates more to the customs procedures, which help expedite the release and clearance of goods. And finally, the third area is on freedom of transit. And this is particularly important to landlocked countries. And in Africa, we have 16 landlocked countries. Now let's take some statistics. In Africa, tariff protection is less than, on average, 10%. However, if non-tariff barriers are taken into account, the tariff equivalent for these measures can be over 280%. And full implementation of the agreement's 36 measures can generate an additional $1 trillion of global trade each year, and could potentially reduce trade costs by 14% for African countries, and has a potential to increase African exports by 35%, according to a WTO report. And more generally speaking, trade facilitation reforms are crucial to Africa's export diversification efforts, integration into regional and global value chains, and the promotion of investment. And special economic zones are established as stepping stones to reach those same objectives. Now, which measures benefit African countries and are important for the proper functioning of economic zones? While generally speaking, the 36 TF measures are beneficial, I would like to highlight some key measures which have more impact on export performance and lowering of trade costs based on different research that has been conducted and case studies. So the first measure is the availability of information and transparency. This is paramount to traders and especially small traders. Being able to receive the trade-related information that is needed on specific goods and on import and export requirements and procedures is fundamental. With that comes setting up, for example, inquiry points where traders can contact and get the information they need related to a specific import or export related good. Now, second, more broadly, the second measure is risk management. This measure is really the basis of any simplified import and export customs procedures. Having the system in place helps customs administrations concentrate on high-risk goods entering the country, rather than checking every consignment, which would cause delays and extra costs, especially for small traders. This is definitely a prerequisite for any measures which help speed the release and clearance of customs, such as pre-arrival processing and post-clearance audits. Another important measures connected to risk management is authorized operators, which allows traders with a good track record to get their goods cleared faster, and it would benefit from less inspection and deferred duty payments. A fourth trade facilitation measure is border agency coordination. We all know that African traders, they suffer from cumbersome border control formalities, unpredictable crossing times, and also lengthy border crossing procedures. And we also do know that trade transactions do not just concern customs, but there are many agencies at the border, whether it's health, agriculture, standards, the port authorities, where there needs to be proper coordination among them to expedite the release and clearance of goods. And also cross-border coordination with neighboring countries is crucial for landlocked countries. Finally, the most, let's say, ambitious trade facilitation measure in the agreement and the most expensive to implement is the single window. Now, the single window requires having border agency coordination as a prerequisite. And instead of having to go to each border agency individually, traders would deposit their trade-related documentation to a single location, and they do so once. This in turn gets disseminated to all other border agencies, and which would eventually reduce clearance times greatly. Single windows can either be electronic, and also can be done regionally. Now that I've mentioned these measures, so what is the status of implementation of the TFA in Africa? Now, 3 years on, where does Africa stand? Now, to date, 39 African countries out of 44 have ratified the TFA. We have currently 44 African countries who are WTO members, and there are 9 African countries in the process of acceding to the WTO. So 39 out of the 44 have ratified the TFA, and almost all have notified to the WTO their implementation commitments. The implementation rate of African countries to date is around 37%. So we have over 60% of the measures are not yet implemented. 23% of those require more time, and 40% require technical assistance and capacity building, and therefore more time to be implemented. Now, while this reflects African countries' overall positive engagement in the ratification and implementation of the agreement, the measures which have not been implemented yet and require more time and technical assistance for it to be implemented are those with most benefits to African traders, the authorities, and the well-functioning of special economic zones. Like I've mentioned, now the implementation rate of transparency-related measures range between 15 to 18%. Risk management and authorized operators are 18 to 19%. Border agency coordination has an implementation rate of 16% among African countries. And finally, the single window, the rate is quite low. It's only 4.5%. Now, as I've mentioned, I mean, understandably, yes, I mean, these measures do require technical assistance capacity building, but the implementation timeframes for them is quite long. So it ranges between 2030 to 2035 for many of the African countries. Now, this takes me to challenges for implementation. And here I'll be just brief. According to the World Bank, no country is really starting from scratch. There's been a lot of donor support that has been provided prior to the TFA and currently as their support being happening in the pipeline in the area of trade facilitation. And while some measures require a lot of financial and technical assistance, many measures require soft types of assistance, like, for example, awareness raising, updating of legislation and procedures, institutional arrangements. And really, there are implementation challenges that are not resolved with technical assistance and capacity building. Things like competition between government agencies, of which we have many in the area of trade facilitation, poor public-private partnerships, lack of coordination between agencies on the national or regional levels, and a lack of sustained political will and commitment to change. So finally, what are the policy recommendations? What can we say? First and foremost, African ownership is paramount. So African countries need to embrace the trade facilitation agreement as part of a pro-trade development agenda, with the aim of improving the overall business and trading environment, and to attract investment. And this goes without saying for the special economic zones. And the implementation of the measures that I mentioned before needs to happen sooner rather than later. If Africans want to trade regionally and also on the continent very soon. And secondly, it's important to engage with the business community. They are the main stakeholders. And this needs to be throughout this whole process. Thirdly, support from international partners and donors needs to be well coordinated and part of comprehensive implementation plans, whereby sequencing of implementation is taken into account. For example, to have a proper a single window, we need to have border agency coordination. Same goes for the customs clearance procedures. We need to have a proper risk management in place. And finally, we need to acknowledge that in any reform process, there are winners and losers. And this is also the case for trade facilitation reforms. So support and adjustments will need to be made. I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Mena. Thank you very much for this comprehensive and extensive presentation of the implementation status of the WTO Trade Facilitation Agreement, with all the challenges that you have mentioned, and the recommendations that needs to be taken up seriously by the government and all the other actors to be able to reach the objective of easing up access to, to landlocked countries, or reducing the cost of trading, etc. So this is very important to know, because as I said before, in order to trade efficiently or optimally in the region, when we talk about intra-African trade, we need to really make sure that cross-border trading is very smooth, that there are no issues in terms of moving goods across countries. And you mentioned access to interland countries. And I know that when we look at special economic zones, we always talk about say location and connectivity are two factors that can make, that are taken into account when we design special economic zones. And here I would like to bring in Mr. Paul Hansen. Mr. Paul Hansen from UNCTAD, and ask him what are the links that you see between special economic zones, transport facilitation, trade facilitation. I mean, picking up from where Dr. Mena has left us, what can you tell us in terms of how the transport facilitation also can be developed in the whole facilitation trade agreement thing, and also looking at the special economic zones? What is your take on that?
Thank you very much, moderator, and thank you for inviting UNCTAD also to this event. Happy Africa Integration Day to everybody. I'm very pleased to having joined you here. I will use a few slides if you allow, so I will try to get that on the screen here if that's possible. Do you see the slides? I believe you do. It is clear that there are very important links between African integration and the development of trade. And I think we all know that the interregional trade in Africa is somewhat suffering. It is the continent with the lowest interregional trade percentages. And this is definitely something that needs to be looked at in further detail and improved in order to also improve the economic development in the continent. There are many people that are talking about trading out of poverty, and that is not only something you do with countries outside the African region, but the interregional trade is an important element to do this. Obviously, this is not something that trade and transport facilitation can do alone. There are other issues like diversification of products, the productivity and the product machinery that is in the region. But trade and transport facilitation are definitely important elements. Just a few elements on special economic zones. In 2019, UNCTAD published our annual investment report, and there is a special chapter on special economic zones. And I think there are both positives and negatives, and maybe some opportunities and challenges. I've just taken a few of the slides that are available and some of the information that are available. First of all, on this slide, you will see that from economic zones that have replied to the survey that was done in connection with this report, around 47% of the economic zones are estimated to be either underutilized or heavily underutilized. And of course, when you talk about economic zones and having those as the economic development opportunity, this is certainly a worry if economic zones are underutilized or heavily underutilized. So I think there needs to be some strategic thinking by economic zones and countries when they start considering developing economic zones. Another issue are some of the key challenges of economic zones. And there are two issues here that I will try to address. And from the top, you will see the second, where 43% of the respondents have said that there is an issue and challenges, insufficient infrastructure. So connectivity to the hinterland, and whether that is the immediate hinterland, the surrounding hinterland, or countries like Mena has mentioned already, and Gokan, of landlocked countries that are connected to the economic zone. There need obviously to be physical infrastructure, but at the same time, as it was also already mentioned, and you will see on the lower part of the screen, insufficient facilitation services. So the hard infrastructure and the soft infrastructure, meaning the facilitation mechanisms for the transport and trade facilitation, needs to be in place. And you cannot have, on the one hand, first-class hard infrastructure and a subpar soft infrastructure, such as IT infrastructure. You have to have these go together and vice versa. COVID, of course, has been a particular challenge all over the world, and in Africa in particular. We have experienced many challenges, and COVID and the restrictions that COVID has led to a number of obstacles for international trade. International supply and value chains have been greatly affected, and it is for small traders and big traders. Border agencies have faced a number of challenges for anything in connection with cross-border trade, import, export, transit. And it is not only medical supplies, donation, and essential consignments that have suffered. These, obviously, during this period needs prioritization, but it is all international trade that has suffered. We have seen tremendous queues and waiting times, but we have also seen developments that have gone in positive directions and where countries and regions have reacted very quickly. So in this specific case, we have to have a very clear and good balance on general facilitation and then facilitation of these specific product groups. UNCTAD has proposed an action plan for countries on how to ensure in the wake of COVID and other crises that international trade can continue and move on. And there are 9 points here that we are promoting, from uninterrupted shipping, maintaining ports open, having corridors open and functioning, speedy customs clearance and other clearance, facilitating and coordinating cross-border trade. And this is what Mena already mentioned, the border agency cooperation, and I will come back to why I have circled this in particular. Ensuring transit, having transit functioning is particularly important for hinterland and landlocked countries. Safeguard and update transparency and information. Go paperless. Mena talked about the single window, and it is exactly this. Having as many as the procedures automated, address the legal implications, and protect shippers and transport services alike. And all of these, of course, if you have an economic zone, what you are doing there, if you are not ensuring these 9 points, you will endanger the efficacy of your economic zone. Now, why have I in particular highlighted point 4 here, facilitate and coordinate cross-border trade? Well, I will come back to that. But all of these issues in relation to COVID, in relation to economic zones, and in relation to general economic and political development in the world, we have tried also to depict in this illustration here. There are some general and current trends that we see, and COVID is accentuating many of these. So we have an issue that we call reshoring. There has for many, many years been a trend on outsourcing, but for various reasons, protectionism, COVID, and other issues, there is a drive towards, in many countries, reshoring, trying to look at shorter supply chains, rebundling the supply chains. And this, of course, goes away from having necessarily production far away from where your markets. It goes away from having very diverse supply chains. So the diversification issue is the next issue. So continued fragmentation of supply chains, it's one trend, but also we see in many cases to try and consolidate this and having production, assembly, and distribution very close to each other. And this goes into a regional direction. And there are some replications of this coming all together in trying to see shorter supply chains within regions. So I think these are some trends that economic zones have to be very aware about, have to focus on to a much larger issue in order to try and have the right policies to respond to some of these trends. Now, I had circled the coordination and the facilitation, and Mena mentioned a number of issues in the trade facilitation agreement. So what is it that economic zones particularly can do, and how can they be a part of this? Well, one of the articles in the trade facilitation agreement that Mena did not mention was Article 23.2 on national trade facilitation committees. What are national trade facilitation committees? These are national committees that are set up to facilitate the coordination and implementation of international trade at country level. What are these how are these committees composed? Well, they should be composed in our view and according to best practices of all the stakeholders at national level, be it on the one hand the public stakeholders, so customs authorities, but not only customs authorities, all agencies that are involved in cross-border trade, so agriculture, technical standard, Ministry of Trade, and on the other hand, all of the private sector operators, so freight forwarders, transporters, banks, and so on. And one stakeholder here that we often see is not involved in this are economic zones. So I think maybe one of the conclusions of this session is that for economic zones to be a player at national level, to ensure that some of the specificities that economic zones are needing in facilitation, whether it's trade facilitation or transport facilitation, to ensure that some of these issues are addressed, economic zones need to be part of national trade facilitation committees, have a voice, and I've here tried to depict how these national trade facilitation committees can be set up in a three-part level, on strategic level, operational level, and technical level, where various issues can be discussed, and where economic zones could be an important stakeholder to input some of the issues. So I think this is certainly a recommendation that we would have for the economic zones, be part of the national level engagement and on trade facilitation issues, which is one of the elements, or one of the many elements on economic zones and their operations. National trade facilitation committees are an important part. The last slide I will have and address is then the role of economic zones in a regional context and in the connectivity in a region. I think economic zones is an obvious gateway to regional markets and to the regional development perspective. And in this context, we see, and that is also very clear from the survey that UNCTAD has made in the investment report from 2019. Countries and economic zones have to be very strategic. We see from some of the outcomes and some of the data we have in our report, some countries have been very strategic on having a few zones that encompass certain issues, and certainly in many of these economic zones, one element is the facilitation element that is important to have either a free zone, a customs zone, with all the elements of trade and transport facilitation integrated. Other countries have a diversity of zones, many different types of zones. As Gokan mentioned, you can set up zones, of course, in different ways. But maybe there are, in some countries, so many zones that it is difficult to see the economic impact and opportunity. And if you look at the figures actually from the report, some of the countries that are doing best in global value chain integration, foreign direct investment opportunities and inflow, and trade development are those that have a clear strategy, have zones that encompass many of the policy issues, and do not have maybe a plethora of zones that are competing against each other. And I think setting up zones in a region, you have to be very strategic and see what is your niche and what is your competitive advantage. I think it's important to work within the region and within the sub-regions, be it AU, be it some of the sub-regions like East Africa Community, ECOWAS, and others, and see what is the policy that is implemented there. How is it that an economic zone or maybe a group of economic zones can actually integrate in that policy context and obtain or work on developing some advantages and some opportunities in that regional context, working closely with the regional and sub-regional frameworks, I believe, or we believe, is very important. Economic zones, many see this as something that is set up next to a port. I'm not a specialist in this location issue, but I think it is given today that economic zones can be located in different places. There can be, yes, zones that are set up next to port infrastructure, but there are also opportunities to set up zones next to, for instance, inland dry ports and other already developed structures where there, for instance, are good customs, where there are good facilities, where there is solid and robust IT structures that you can take advantage of. And then Mena has already mentioned that certain of the trade facilitation agreement obligations, or those obligations that are in the CFTA, lends themselves particularly to regional collaboration, and where maybe economic zones have a special interest, such as transit border agency cooperation, authorized economic operators, information through internet, single windows, and so on. And these can all assist both economic zones in their development, but can also assist in crisis response and recovery that we are facing right now. So it is our firm belief that economic zones are very well positioned to take advantage of the challenges and the opportunities that the present situation have created, and that the regional integration that is happening in Africa, that the challenges and opportunities that are in this context are presenting. So I believe from my part, this is basically all I would like to present today. So I will go out of the presentation and hopefully go back. And of course, if there are any questions, I'm very pleased to answer these either now or later on. I will have to drop off at a certain time. I have another obligation, but thank you for the opportunity, and continued happy Africa Integration Day. Thank you.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you very much for your presentation, which is also very interesting. Looking at transport facilitation, looking at specifically how we need to devise our strategy when we are establishing zones. This is very important. This will look at locations. I mean, look at the market, the niche that we need to find, not have competing zones in a region. This is very important. And you also mentioned the fact that it's important to take advantage of the infrastructures that are already existing infrastructure or services, in order to really leverage the positive, I would say, results that zones can bring out. So this is very interesting. And thank you very much again for this contribution, for this input. I would just, staying on the issue of taking advantage of the capacities or the infrastructure or the services, the soft or the hard infrastructure that we have when we position our special economic zones. I would like to move on towards one issue which is also very important, which is how do we bring in the local economy in or create linkages with the local economy when we develop special economic zones. And we know, Ms. Terfa Ashwe, that one of the issues that spark criticism on economic zones and raise questions sometimes over their economic contribution in developing economies is that they seem to usually operate more or less as silos or enclaves with few linkages with local suppliers or the national economy. And the AFCTA emphasizes, though, that socio-economic inclusivity for the development of Africa is one of its principal objectives. So what is your take on that? And what are, in your experience, the strategies or policies that African government need to put in place to address efficiently these issues when designing and implementing special economic zones? Mrs. Terfa Ashwe, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'll just like to, I think the host is supposed to share my slides, but if it's not possible, I'll share it from my end. Okay.
It's loading.
Okay, that's great.
Not yet.
Anyway, before that, as that's loaded, I'll just like to say hello and good evening from Abuja, Nigeria. It's a pleasure to be part of this very important conversation happening to celebrate the decision to create a single market to promote economic growth and development on the continent. It's a decision that was made to benefit our businesses, small, large, micro, and medium-sized, young entrepreneurs on the continent, IT startups, women-owned businesses, and large firms. So congratulations and happy Integration Day. I am truly proud and very happy to be part of this very unique and hopefully many more to come and conferences of the kind. So I see it's still loading, but today really what I will be covering, I would like to, again, reemphasizing the importance of business inclusivity in our economic zone development strategy. So I'll be asking 2 questions and hopefully guiding us through a thought process that allows us to reflect on these questions. Why business inclusivity should be should be at the center of our economic zone development strategies, and how economic zones can be built to be an inclusive space for developing local firm capabilities. Over the course of the next few minutes, I will be posing a few reflective questions and raising certain well-known economic growth challenges centered around these 2 points. I'm not going to be posing solutions because I think that each country is very unique, and it's more important to emphasize performance and to build strategies that reflect what your individual country development plans, how they have defined inclusivity for themselves. And so I won't be posing solutions, oh, this is the grand plan or the roadmap for inclusivity, but I think there are certain points and approaches that can be taken in thinking and in strategizing and in putting together development plans that could bring in deeper inclusive practices for inclusive practices within these economic zones. Is the slide up though?
Not yet.
Not yet.
Yeah, there are some attempts from the organizer as well, but it's still not coming up.
Okay. Okay, fantastic.
Okay.
So I see the first slide
now.
Okay, so we can go straight on to the second slide. So why economic zones? One of the first questions I'll be asking. Economic zones are one of the development approaches handpicked and embedded into the AFCFTA to stimulate industrialization on the continent. The African Continental Free Trade Area, I'm sure a lot of us are very happy to say, is a continental legal framework for regional trade integration, and it recognizes special economic zones as a development tool for economic growth. Just for the purpose of reference, I have put up the article there from the AFCFTA, which highlights the purpose of the special economic arrangements or zones, which is to accelerate development and the requirement for regulation and the forming of rules around how they are to be managed on the continent. So going again to the next slide, why economic zones? It's one thing to know that it's part of our toolkit, that economic zones are part of our development toolkits. But it's another thing to understand why it is part of our toolkit for development. Why is this an issue? Why do we think that it's something that we should integrate within our economies? Why should it play such a focal point within the region economic growth plan? And to answer this question, I would like to bring our attention to the map, which I see has gone off again. But what you will see when it does load is a product space map, which is developed by the Harvard Kennedy School's Growth Lab. It's part of the Atlas for Economic Complexity. It's a public tool. It's available for use. But here represents 800 goods using real world data. The different nodes are products, and then the spokes, so to say, are the relatedness between one product and the other. So the growth lab, research from the growth lab shows that countries tend to diversify more by moving into nearby or related products, or into those that require similar know-how to build on existing capabilities. So it will be easier for a firm to move from a product that is related in terms of know-how and capability than to jump from one product space into a completely different product space. So each product here is categorized or grouped into 9 different product groups. And these product groups range from low complexity products to high complexity products. You can imagine that the amount of capability or the amount of know-how that is needed for a firm to, to produce corn will be very different from that which is required to put together a smartphone or to, and so this is just what I mean in terms of low complexity to higher complex products. And this movement in terms of complexity is enabled through the increase in the application of technology from low complex products, of course, and transforming them into higher complex products. And this is sometimes referred to as structural transformation when it's done across the economy, or industrialization, depending on how you want to put it. But as you can see from the map, we have 9 different product sectors. And each, as I've already said, each node is a product, and then the spokes represent the relatedness to the next product within that particular, shall we say, product cluster. The 9 products there are minerals, stones. If you can see clearly, it's already there: agriculture, textile, metals, chemicals, machinery, electronics, and vehicles. So I'll just ask very kindly if you could just hold this image in your mind, and the image, the colors, the nodes, and the spokes, and the different sectors. Just hold that in your mind for a second while we go on to the next slide. Here, we see the 8 largest economies in Africa as at 2019. Annual GDP, these were the countries that produced the most. Cumulatively, this represents about 67% of the continent's GDP, amounting to a total of 2.6 trillion USD. Nigeria there with 476 or 403, depending on which rate that you're using. South Africa with $352 billion, Egypt with 302, Morocco with 119, Kenya 98, Angola 91.5, Ethiopia 91.2. Between Kenya, Angola, Ethiopia, it's between 5 times to 3 times. Nigeria is about 5 times to 3 times the size of the last 3 countries there. And this is just factual. I'm just stating what it is that we already know. Going to the next stage. So now I'm going to ask for a little bit of your indulgence. I'll kindly ask that you take a look at this slide. So the question is, which economy is this? We still have the list of 8 economies that were just listed in the previous slide. And you remember the product map that I had shared earlier on. And I'll be showing you a series of different product spaces for specific economies in Africa. And I'll ask that if you could make a mental note of which, like I'll ask the question and just make a mental note of which economy you think it is. Preferably, if you could just chat, include in the chat there, which economy you think it is. That would be more helpful, because then it will give me an idea of, it will help me fill out where your thinking is and how well you're able to appreciate my line of thought. So right here, we have the products space for a particular economy in Africa. So the question is, which economy is this? Is this South Africa? Is this Nigeria? Is this Kenya? Is this Ethiopia? Or is this Egypt? I'll give us a few minutes to just reflect. Which of the 5 economies do we think this is? South Africa, Nigeria, Kenya, Ethiopia, or Egypt? Somebody says Ethiopia, very interesting. Another person says Nigeria, Egypt. So So the first three answers, Nigeria again. Majority of respondents currently think that it's Nigeria. Another person says South Africa. We have two Egypts. Okay, so let's say about, okay, so between South Africa, Nigeria, and Egypt, these are the top three. Okay, South Africa, definitely. Somebody has said, between the numbers that we have there, majority of respondents already have said they think this is South Africa. So this is actually Ethiopia. Let's go to the next slide. This is the product space for, yes, this is the product space for Ethiopia as at 2018. We see this quite, okay, a little bit of color there in textile and apparel, sorry, in textile showing activity, economic activity in that space. We see economic activity as well within the agricultural space. We see a little bit of splash of color within machinery, a little bit in electronics as well, and some in metal. So this is basically the product space. It's not as colorful as the first slide that you saw, but it does have some color. Very interesting. So this is Ethiopia. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is another question. Again, bear in mind the first slide that you saw covering the global product space of 800 goods. Next slide, please. So the next slide, is this South Africa? Is this Egypt, Nigeria, Kenya, or Angola? There's much more color here. We see more activity within the agricultural space than in the textile space. We see a lot of color in machinery, chemicals, cars, vehicles. I wouldn't have wanted to discuss it because I feel like if I start to mention the different products, then it immediately gives you a hint on which economy it is. I would have rather preferred, yeah, okay, so everybody says South Africa. I think it's my fault. I shouldn't have given the clues. But yes, so this is the economy. This is the product space for South Africa. Next slide, please. I think everybody is in agreement with that. Next slide. This is another economy. Yes, next slide. It's South Africa, 2018. So this is another economy. Again, please guess which economy you think it is. Is this Kenya? Is this Egypt? Is it Nigeria? Is it Morocco? Or is it Angola? Angola. Okay. I'll give a few more people an opportunity to respond, and then we'll move Nigeria, and then we'll move Kenya, Angola. So the majority of people responding think it's Angola. Somebody already, the slide was ahead of me. It's actually Nigeria. So this is the product space for Nigeria, which I guess for Nigerians, this is not so much of a surprise. A lot of activity in the crude and petroleum crude oil exports there. Very little activity in agriculture and very little activity in any other product sector actually. And also very poor connectivity to new sectors for expansion. So yeah, you can tell by that it's also quite functioning a lot in very low complex products. Let's move on to the next slide. Sorry, that was, yeah, I know it was written Nigeria. Please don't go to the next slide until we go over, yeah, until we have the poll is finished. Go back, please. Okay, thank you. So which economy do you think this is? Algeria, Egypt, Morocco, Kenya, or Angola? Yeah, I know it showed Angola. So we'll just move on to the next slide because it did already show that this is Angola. So I gave you another cheat sheet there. Again, it's also a bit similar to Nigeria's product space. A lot of activity within the petroleum and crude oils, but not a lot in other product spaces. Also not very connected to new product spaces. Very little activity within the clusters there in the center and everything. So let's go to the final slide. This is the last poll, just so that yeah, yes, thank you. So that's Angola. Next slide, please. Previous slide. So to go back to my question, to go back to my question, my first question, which is why business inclusivity should be centered at our economic zone development strategies. And I think from the exercise that we just carried out now, it's pretty clear that, first of all, we need to build because we need to build firm level know-how to enable us to be able to enter into new and more complex products. Now, if those are the top 8 economies in Africa, and they're the ones that are contributing the most to the current African GDP, and we can see that there is potential for certain countries to, to expand, showing that there is know-how in certain new product spaces, although they're not functioning in those new product spaces yet. It's obvious that we need to, there is a huge demand for structural transformation, to stimulate economic growth on the continent. And basically there's a need for new products of higher complexity, which will mean more complex jobs with higher wages and more competitive firms. It's also a very important strategy for job creation. These economic zones are very important, also very important for technology development. It's also an approach to support the development of an innovative and inclusive business environment in countries and on the continent at large. And it's also a strategy to drive and attract investment. We'll go to the next slide. Why is this important? I think it was just important to drive in. I had mentioned earlier that there are certain growth challenges that the continent is currently facing that really emphasizes the need for us to strategically dip into our toolbox of development, approaches that we have available to us. One of which is youth and employment. Recent ILO data show that that of the 38.1% estimated total working poor in sub-Saharan Africa, 23.5% of them are young people. We know that skills and education, as important as it is, wages and jobs are created by firms. It's the way you could educate more people, but how are they going to work? Where are they going to work? We need to have more efficient firms working within our local economies, and it's important that these regional economic zones that we're building across the continent, as many as they are able to feed into this these core challenges that we're having to address as a continent. Access to financial services is also another thing. We know that a lot of time economic activity tends to follow, financial services tend to follow economic activity. And where we locate these economic zones are very important to opening up new segments of the economy to new financial services, which means deeper inclusion for micro, small, and medium-sized enterprises within the country. We also know that we're trying to address rapid population growth. There is the estimation by the UN that by 2050, the African population would have doubled to about 2.4 billion inhabitants, and a majority of this will be less than 25 years old. So there is a huge demand to create jobs for those young people that will be coming into the economy, representing about 60% of unemployment in population in Africa at the moment. So there's quite a lot of demand. We need to improve women's participation in the economy. This again matters for inclusivity because we have a number of women-owned businesses that are serving as the engine for growth within our economies now, and it's important to make sure that they're moved from the informal sector into our formal sector so that they can actually feed into our growth plans and how we grow as a continent. Then there's also the need to strengthen the integration of small and medium-sized enterprises in the economy. This is also, again, very related to the other points I had just raised. We can educate more people. It's very important. I'm a strong believer in skills, but I also know that the more jobs, the more people that are coming out of universities, the more of these young people that are going to schools, there's higher demand for them to get into jobs. And we find that even when you take a deeper look into the employment of labor market in Africa, even those people that are operating that are employed are in most cases underemployed. So we're trying to get them into higher paid jobs better quality jobs and things like that. And so these are some of the things, the priorities that I think we should have in mind, or our economic zone organizations and countries that are building these strategies and development plans should have in mind when they're thinking about inclusivity and building inclusive economic zones. So in a nutshell, next slide please. So in a nutshell, economic zones.
But you?
Sorry?
Yes, just if you can sum up quickly, please. We're running out of time. So
okay.
Yeah.
No problem. So actually, if we could just go to the last slide. Sorry, the second, previous slide. I just have a few final thoughts. So you interrupted me right on time. Next slide, please. So final thoughts really. I was going to expand a little bit, but I'll just put this out there. It's important that we adopt an approach that focuses on performance and not form. It's not enough to have 50 trade zones or economic zones within your country if none of them are performing, or if 10% of them are performing. It's important that we measure performance and not just structure and what it is that we're trying to duplicate within our countries. It's important that we understand the unique climate and business climate that they were functioning in. And the best way to do this really is to consult with the private sector and include diverse actors in the framing, development, and planning process for your your economic zones. It's also important to put in place knowledge networks and policies that allow capability developed within these economic zones to feed into local firms. This could, a few ideas could include public and private research development projects, so encouraging collaboration on research and development between the public and private sector, especially those that are based within these economic zones. Encourage and facilitate the adoption of supply development programs. Encourage policies that support, the sharing of facilities with small and medium-sized enterprises. So if you have warehouses that are within these economic zones, how can SMEs get access to it? How can they, improve their relationship with the firms that are there? Another thing is to allow for cross-border exchange of know-how. This is on the regional level as well. If you realize, going again to the product space, if part of your strategy is to build capability in a particular sector that a country within the region already has, know-how on, you should be thinking about how you can come up with a strategy to learn from that country. How can you absorb that know-how, which then goes again to thinking about the role of trade and services and the role of the flow of information within your economic zones. It's important to think of these zones not just as big spaces for hard infrastructure, but also as idea spaces and innovation hubs that can feed into how it is that you grow. And most importantly, it's important that we track and monitor inclusivity within these zones. So again, going back to the first point that I made on emphasizing performance. So it's important that we identify measurable indicators to track inclusivity, whether it's how many jobs are being created or how many firms are operational, or track these, identify measurable indicators, report on these indicators to your stakeholders, including those people based within the firms, the local economy, local government where the firm is, the economic zone is based, and engage on those results. Use the results as feedback on how to improve on performance, how to better strengthen and deepen inclusivity, how to listen to understand better the functioning and the ecosystem that you have created here, and how it can then even provide more data into your overall trade and integration strategy as a country. Thank you very much. Last slide. Thanks so much. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Alpha. Thank you. It's very passionate and very comprehensive as well. Unfortunately, we are running out of time, but we still have two more panelists who will intervene. And I would like also later to be able to go through the questions. We are getting a lot of them. So thank you. Mr. Michael Schmitz, you are a senior expert at the Investment and Technology Promotion Office in Germany, promoting investment and technology cooperation between German companies and partners in developing countries in sectors such as industry, energy, agriculture, food processing, infrastructure development, health sector. What do you think that African economic zones ought to do to promote the dynamic benefits associated with special special economic zones, such as technological upgrading, and how can intra-Africa trade help to increase the technology content on the continent, as medium and high technology products today, we know, account for 27% of the total intra-Africa merchandise trades. So in terms of transfer of technology, upgrading the technological content on the Africa, trades markets, what do you think? What is your take on that? What are your views, please?
Can you hear me? All right. Okay. Thank you very much, Cynthia. Thank you to the panel for this brilliant introduction overview of so many aspects that are crucial for for reaping the benefits of the African Free Trade Agreement, and also celebrating this special day. Africa Integration Day is a great sign. It reminds us a bit of the breakdown of the Cold War, of the opening up of Eastern Europe after the breakdown of socialism. New opportunities are emerging, and this is the biggest free trade agreement that's been signed since the World Trade Organization was formed. So this is, in these times, a very positive sign. I work for UNIDO, the specialized organization for industrial development of the United Nations, and we are very much devoted to the Sustainable Development Goal 9, which is about industry, about innovation, and about infrastructure. So this is a topic like how to transfer technology by using special economic zones fits in perfectly, because it's about investment, but it's also about infrastructure. And the idea also is to move towards innovation, using special economic zones as a centers of excellence. UNIDO is very much promoting this by various country strategies on industrialization, where the development of industrial zones is a key component. We have also recently, last year, released a handbook on industrial zones, and also a book on handbook on eco-industrial zones. So this is also what my previous colleagues here on the panel mentioned, that industrial development, industrial zones are increasingly linked to the issue of climate change, resource efficiency, and obviously also linkages, backward and forward linkages into the local economy. So it's about, it's also about increasing the share of manufacturing. I mean, this is something we are very much concerned about. We want to avoid a situation whereby African countries develop in the service sector and suffer from so-called premature deindustrialization. The industrial base is important for any long-term and sustainable development. And the question is, how can this be achieved? Technology is always an important component. Then there's the question, which technology does a country need to develop faster, and who is supposed to provide this technology? In the case of many African countries, we actually believe that the intra-African investment flows, that is investments, say, for example, by North African countries that have some degree of industrial, like light industries and experience in these markets, they can be very effective at promoting technologies that are, again, maybe copied, taken over machinery from international partners, European partners, but the conduit, the best way to implement this project is to target these sort of intra-African trade investment flows. This also includes South Africa, as we've seen in the previous presentation. The complexity of the South African industry is, the diversity is large, and so there's a lot of benefits that can spill over into neighboring countries in the Southern Africa and the SADC region, for example. And this is, and then on the other hand, FDI has not been mentioned. I still think that foreign direct investment also from outside of the African continent should play a major role. This is actually what we do here in Germany. We are promoting mainly German, but European companies as well to locate, to invest in African markets, to find partners. Our experience is maybe quite interesting that the drivers of investments in sub-Saharan Africa, for example, will probably not be international companies. It has to be the local companies that are seeking partnerships with foreign partners if they want to develop value chains, because this is the easiest way to enter these markets in our experience. And I mean, just looking at German industry only created 8,000 jobs in the last 5 years in sub-Saharan Africa. It's just 8,000 jobs, and we know that every year we have 20 million young people entering the labor market that need to be absorbed. So, but other countries like, say, Turkey, like China, Morocco, Tunisia, South Africa, they have much more potential in terms of job creation. And this also involves some technology transfer. And it's important to have a strategy, as we said, as my preceding speakers said, an industrial strategy that focus also on FDI, but also on using the local industry. Say it's a resource-intensive industry, to develop value chains along these lines. That means to develop, rather than extracting raw materials and exporting them, to have a strategy for including local supply chains. And this is something that's a political challenge, I think, in all countries. And economic zones can provide a great environment for this. Creating economic zones, so special economic zones around large companies, large conglomerates, sort of as a needs-oriented approach that takes account of the private sector, and also in terms of operation of economic zones, the private sector has a role in order to market them more efficiently. We also know that and another trend is urbanization in Africa, as in Asia and other continents as well. Urbanization and the increase of the role of the knowledge economy. This means that also the location of industrial zones will change, and the nature, it will be merged with concepts for sustainable urban development. And this also then allows the involvement of research institutes, of innovation hubs, of making it also interesting for larger corporations. And we see this in many countries, that multinational companies are tapping on the huge talent pool that is available in many African countries. So the challenge for investors when approaching zones have been already mentioned. I mean, apart from the free trade access to the neighboring countries, of course, increasing the size of these markets, it's non-tariff barriers, it's red tape, it's above all maybe infrastructure. It's the hard facts that limit the size of the market. So there needs to be a very careful analysis of the corridors, the connectivity that can be developed, and this needs regional cooperation. And this is also something that is included in our programs. We have several challenges also in the fields of skills. This was mentioned. We also and the technology transfer takes place usually in the field of vocational training as well, because apart from high-tech research, industrial skills are not available in most countries, and the private sector needs to be involved in that, and they can be a driver, especially Central European investors. They have concepts for developing vocational training schemes that can be linked to industrial zones. And our projects also with the German government, with UNIDO, where we're linking special sectoral initiatives are also have a skills development component. I think I'll leave it to that because we don't have much time left, and maybe we can go into more depth during the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Michael Schmitz, for outlining exactly how special economic zones can be used to support transfer of technology, innovation, and also training, which is very important. As you said, we do not have a lot of time, and again, I would like to go through some questions, so I will quickly go to the last speaker, which is Mr. Jean-Marc Kiolo. Mr. Jean-Marc Kiolo, he focuses on issues relating to economic diversification, and the question is, how do we move from being focusing on exporting, you know, our resources, or let's say diversifying our exports? You know, everybody knows that African economies are very dependent on their natural resources, and but there are examples that have actually managed to diversify their economies, and how can diversify their exports. So how can special economies move away, or let's say use these special economic zones use the natural resources to diversify the economies, is something that Mr. Kilolo is going to discuss about. So Mr. Kilolo, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Cynthia, for having me here as economist with the Economic Commission for Africa based in Yaoundé. So to bring in, I'll talk about industrialization and diversification, and to bring a bit of diversification, I will make my presentation in French. So I think slides are in English, but I'll be speaking in French just to make, this is the way it works. So maybe people can assist me with sharing my PowerPoints. I have few slides out there. Alors donc, comme je disais, mon propos va porter sur l'industrialisation basée sur les ressources naturelles en Afrique, opportunités et défis. Et en guise de background, j'aurai la situation de l'Afrique centrale, qui est très probablement une des régions les mieux nanties en ressources naturelles dans le continent. Alors, dans la deuxième slide, est-ce qu'on peut... Oui. Alors, donc, dans la deuxième slide, ce qu'on voit, c'est que le continent africain est bien doté en ressources naturelles, qu'il s'agisse de sa faune, de sa flore, des eaux, mais également des minerais. Mais il est triste de constater qu'en dépit de ces richesses, l'Afrique, de façon générale, figure en bas de classement des statistiques internationales, qu'il s'agisse de la pauvreté, du chômage ou encore de la nature même de la croissance économique. Une des raisons majeures pour comprendre cette réalité, c'est qu'il y a une très forte dépendance vis-à-vis des ressources naturelles. Donc, la majorité des économies africaines sont des économies qui reposent sur les ressources naturelles. Et cela pose un problème. Pourquoi? Tout simplement parce que les ressources naturelles sont très volatiles. Les prix de ces matières premières sont très volatiles sur les marchés internationaux. Et donc, compte tenu des fluctuations continues de ce genre de prix, donc il y a un effet de pass-through où les chocs sont transmis à ces économies. On peut voir qu'un certain nombre de pays, depuis 2014, où on observe une chute des prix de pétrole, la plupart, sinon tous les exportateurs de pétrole en Afrique se portent mal et ont signé par ailleurs des programmes d'ajustement structurel avec le FMI. Et donc, cette réalité nous invite à repenser le modèle économique. Et donc, en tant que tel, il faudrait procéder à une transformation structurelle de l'économie. Donc, par transformation structurelle, on entend ici un transfert de la main-d'œuvre vers du secteur agricole vers des secteurs à forte productivité. On peut penser ici au secteur manufacturier qui est très embryonnaire, mais également dans le secteur des services. Et donc, pour réaliser cette transition, les zones économiques spéciales, en particulier celles à dimension transfrontalière, seraient donc un outil adéquat pour transformer les économies africaines, mais aussi assurer une intégration régionale. Les présentateurs avant moi ont souligné le fait que grâce à la ZLECAf, donc la zone de libre-échange continentale africaine, l'Afrique est aujourd'hui un des plus grands marchés. Donc, il y a un potentiel qu'il faudrait que nos économies ou notre capacité de production devraient tirer profit. Il ne faudrait pas que ça soit seulement la chasse gardée, mettons, des économies ou des industriels opérant en dehors du continent. Ceci dit, on peut passer à la prochaine slide. Et donc, ici, j'aimerais discuter 2-3 cas brièvement, des possibilités. Alors, j'ai intitulé cette slide comme zone économique spéciale et industrialisation basée sur les mines. Et ici, j'ai pris le cas ici, vous avez une image en fait du cobalt. Donc, le minerai qu'on voit là, c'est le cobalt. D'après les estimations de l'Union européenne, eh bien, le marché du cobalt va représenter à partir de 2025 à très peu près 250 milliards d'euros. Alors, imaginez-vous l'importance de ce marché. Et le marché donc, du cobalt, des batteries en fait, qui sont faites à partir du cobalt, va représenter donc 250 milliards. Donc, c'est une manne. Donc, les Européens aujourd'hui pensent comment se positionner sur ce marché. Or, un fait qui est marquant, c'est que l'Afrique, en particulier l'Afrique centrale, regorge plus de la moitié des réserves mondiales de cobalt. Alors, la question est celle de savoir, va-t-on rester dans un modèle qui est un modèle d'exportation uniquement du minerai, ou plutôt commencer également à développer une industrie à travers les zones économiques spéciales pour les raisons que je vais invoquer plus tard, pour justement tirer parti de cette opportunité. Et cette opportunité permet également de rencontrer un certain nombre d'objectifs du développement durable, notamment l'accès à un travail décent et à la croissance économique. Voyez-vous l'opportunité, 250 milliards. Et également quitter le travail des mines, où on sait que les mines artisanales, c'est un travail pénible, et parfois les gens travaillent sans protection pour un travail en laboratoire, un travail dans des conditions plutôt confortables. Évidemment, pour réaliser cet objectif, il faudrait rencontrer l'objectif de l'ODD 4, qui est l'accès à une éducation de qualité. Et ça, c'est un enjeu important pour le développement industriel de l'Afrique. Il faudrait repenser notre système éducatif. En particulier, ce qu'on constate, le Bureau sous-régional pour l'Afrique centrale mène une étude sur les compétences nécessaires à l'industrialisation en Afrique centrale. Ce qu'on remarque, c'est que de façon générale, en Afrique, on met un accent tout particulier sur des formations plutôt de type littéraire et pas des formations techniques, donc ce qu'on appelle les TVET, les Vocational Training. Donc, c'est des choses que l'on regarde avec mépris aujourd'hui. Alors que dans les économies avancées, qu'il s'agisse des économies d'Asie ou les économies européennes comme l'Allemagne, eh bien, le socle du marché du travail est constitué par les formations techniques. Donc, ça, c'est quelque chose qui est très important. Et bien évidemment, lorsqu'on passe d'un modèle d'extraction minière, qui est un modèle de forte intensité capitalistique, tout simplement dire qu'on a un appareillage important des outils, mais très peu de personnes qui y travaillent. Et il s'agit également d'un secteur où il y a très peu de spillover effect, donc des effets d'entraînement. Donc c'est comme ça que depuis, on va dire, la période des colonies, le secteur des mines s'est développé en parallèle à une économie locale. Donc il y a eu très peu en fait de maillage et d'interconnexion. Pour paraphraser le professeur Noro Michel, qui écrivait dans son livre Économie africaine, ce qu'il disait, c'est que le problème de l'Afrique, c'est que l'économie héritée de la colonisation était une économie désintégrée à l'économie locale, mais qui était plutôt intégrée et conçue pour répondre à une demande étrangère. Donc, il faudrait là qu'on puisse repenser véritablement les choses et il faudrait donc rencontrer l'ODD 9, qui est l'ODD qui consacre l'importance de l'innovation et également des infrastructures de qualité. Donc, vous voyez bien, l'image de laboratoire est très explicite. Travailler dans ces conditions requiert un équipement de qualité et un investissement dans l'infrastructure, autant de choses que mes prédécesseurs ont abordées. Et enfin, cet objectif également fait écho à l'ODD 13, gardez s'il vous plaît, revenez sur le premier slide, merci. Et donc, cet ODD qui fait écho justement à la lutte contre le changement climatique. Aujourd'hui, on parle de méga-tendances et une des méga-tendances, c'est le changement climatique. Pourquoi parle-t-on de méga-tendances? Parce que aucun pays, par son action isolée, ne peut renverser la vapeur. Et compte tenu de la conscience internationale par rapport à ces enjeux, on pense aujourd'hui à des sources d'énergie alternatives. Voilà justement un bel exemple, celui donc des batteries qui sont une meilleure alternative au pétrole, au gasoil, qui est très polluant, comme on le sait bien. Et par ailleurs, certains pays en Europe d'ailleurs ont pris les devants pour interdire dès 2021 la circulation des véhicules à base de diesel. Alors ça, c'était le premier exemple de ce qu'on peut faire pour réaliser ce changement structurel et quelques idées pour comment y aller. Le prochain exemple ou l'idée que je voudrais partager, vous pouvez passer au prochain slide s'il vous plaît. Et donc, le prochain slide, c'est les chaînes de valeur agricole et l'industrie du bois. On sait que 37 des 51 pays à faible revenu et à déficit alimentaire sont en Afrique. Pourtant, l'Afrique, notamment l'Afrique centrale avec le bassin du Congo, est un des plus grands poumons grâce à sa biodiversité. Et cette région à elle-même est capable de nourrir toute l'Afrique et au-delà une bonne partie de la planète. Mais ce potentiel n'est pas réalisé. Pourquoi? Parce qu'on demeure majoritairement dans une agriculture vivrière de subsistance qui est caractérisée par de faibles niveaux de productivité. Et donc, si nous mettons en lien ces deux réalités, le fait que la grande majorité donc, des pays à faible revenu et à déficit alimentaire se trouvent en Afrique et le potentiel que regorgent certaines régions, donc c'est un bon motif justement pour renforcer le commerce intra-africain, notamment au niveau agricole, ce qui permettrait justement de rencontrer l'objectif de développement durable 2, celui de lutter contre la faim. Plusieurs initiatives ont été prises au travers du continent. Et mon collègue Hansen de la UNCTAD, UNCTAD, a mentionné certains faits intéressants. C'est qu'il y a des zones économiques spéciales qui n'opèrent pas à pleine capacité et pour lesquelles il n'y a pas assez d'infrastructures. Encore là, nous revenons sur l'importance de l'ODD 9, celui de l'innovation et de l'infrastructure. Dans certains pays, ce que nous avons appris au travers des lectures et de l'expérience, c'est que certains parlent de zones économiques spéciales en achetant quelques tracteurs qui vont pour accélérer la production sans véritablement considérer une réelle agro-industrie. Tout simplement parce qu'il y a une méga tendance qui est importante, celle de l'urbanisation. Nous voyons que de plus en plus, la population africaine vit dans les villes. Les modes de consommation sont différents. Donc, il faudrait également servir convenablement ces populations dans les zones urbaines qui ont des besoins, un style de vie qui se rapproche des pays industrialisés. Donc, voilà pour…
Monsieur Jean-Marc, je suis vraiment désolée, mais nous avons très peu de temps qui nous reste. Donc, si vous pouvez rapidement passer les quelques slides qui vous restent en 2 minutes, ce serait
très
super.
Bien. Ça sera fait. Passons la slide. Passons la slide. Alors donc, ici, quelques facteurs de succès pour justement réaliser le potentiel des zones économiques spéciales. Évidemment, il faudrait une sorte de concentration. Donc, créer véritablement ce que Krugman et Opfeld appellent des économies d'échelle externe. Ne pas faire du saupoudrage. Ce qui nous semble, c'est que la plupart des pays ont pris multiples initiatives. Je pense que les collègues en ont parlé. Par contre, il faut essayer de focaliser, créer une masse critique d'infrastructures, créer une sorte de microcosme économique, un îlot d'excellence, avec l'idée d'avoir une production qui réponde aux standards internationaux. On appelle first class production. Donc, c'est la clé du succès des zones économiques spéciales. Et donc, il faudrait que lorsqu'on envisage l'agriculture, lorsqu'on envisage même la production des produits de bois, qu'on arrête juste d'exporter des agrumes, mais transformer et penser également à une transformation qui soit régionale. Pourquoi? Parce que ce type de ressources sont partagées par plusieurs pays. Donc, il y a lieu de mutualiser les efforts, ce qui va assurer une meilleure intégration économique et aussi faciliter les échanges intra-africains. Dernière slide. Évidemment, il y a des défis aujourd'hui. Nous avons parlé des méga tendances, notamment celle du changement climatique. Il faudrait penser à la durabilité environnementale des processus de production et de certification par des tiers pour accéder aux marchés globaux. Il faut non seulement desservir le marché local, national, régional, africain, mais également les marchés mondiaux pour justement s'assurer de la compétitivité. Plusieurs études économiques montrent effectivement que les entreprises exportatrices sont généralement les plus performantes. Il faudrait également penser à des emplois verts et également et surtout penser à un développement des zones économiques spéciales qui favorise le développement des économies locales, que nos économies, que les entrepreneurs locaux soient véritablement maillés aux chaînes de valeur globales. Et nous pensons ainsi que les zones économiques spéciales peuvent être au cœur de la réalisation des objectifs de développement durable, notamment celles que nous avons présentées. Merci pour l'opportunité.
Merci beaucoup, Monsieur Jean-Marc. Très intéressant encore une fois. Malheureusement, nous n'avons pas le temps. So we will quickly take a couple of questions. Unfortunately, we are running out of time. And the first question that I will pose to, I think this question can go to Mr. Gokan Akinci, if he's still around with us. The question is, knowing that special economic zones are considered extraterritorial, how will this affect the trade with other African countries, especially with those that have integrated regional markets and unified tariffs, tarif extérieur, commun, etc. Yeah. I was directing that question, but…
Can you hear me?
Yes, can you hear? Yes, we can hear you.
Excellent. I'll give a quick response on this to give time for the rest of the discussion. So that's one of the things I was actually talking about, to think about the new concept, basically of SEZs, not really get stuck in the old EPZ model when we are looking at the initiatives. For example, in EAC, we are having issues on defining SEZs versus the older model, in accessing the domestic as well as the regional markets. rather than basically limiting exports or incentives, using incentives to actually promote exports to a certain extent and allowing only a percentage. I think it's better to really look at smart and performance-based incentives and leave exports out of the basically domestic sales and exports out of AEZOs flexible as long as they pay the necessary duties into basically the regional and the domestic markets. I think that's a pretty straightforward way to handle, but then it actually has to be embedded in the existing basically agreements and forward-looking agreements.
Thank you very much. The second question on the list is with recent trends towards reshoring and a possible long-term retreat from globalization, do you believe that zones will seek to increase occupancy rates by targeting tenants who will focus instead on domestic markets? Mr. Paul, he's gone. I'm not sure if Mr. Michael Schmitz, you would like to take that one?
Sure. Yes, that's exactly what's happening, I think, and what needs to happen. Globalization is changing. We're reshoring. I mean, it actually doesn't exclude the attraction of FDI. It just means that FDI will be market seeking, as I say. They will come to Nigeria or other huge markets because of the growing middle class, because of urbanization, the business opportunities that are there in this regional market. Becoming part of global value chains will be more difficult. There will be you need these regional hubs. That's what I tried to mention in my short presentation. Sorry. It's really important. That's why I also mentioned that the local economy, the local business sector, supported by the government, ideally, will be driving this process, and to increase these backward linkages. It's not enough to have just an export processing zone. This is the 70s. That's how China started, and we moved along. You know, now we're talking about circular economy, about energy efficiency, about innovation above all. You know, it's a source for innovation, for skills development, these economic zones, if they're well managed and linked to the local economy. And intra-regional investments also need to increase. I mean, if you look at Europe after the breakdown of socialism, when these markets in Eastern Europe opened up, you had investments in all directions between those countries, not just west to east, but also from east to west and within the eastern part, what used to be socialism. So there needs to be much more of this. So it's not really reshoring, it's actually, I think, mobilizing this investment potential that always has been there. Tapping on a large inflow of globally mobile foreign direct investment is not possible in this situation. So there's an increased need for policies and infrastructure and clear industrial strategies to attract this sort of closer regional type of investment. And foreign direct investment, say, for example, Volkswagen has 8 or 6 locations in Africa now with assembly plants. These are like proto investments, I would say. You know, once they realize these are local markets that are developing, they will increase their commitment and they will involve local suppliers and become part of this economic industrial transformation, ideally.
D'accord. Thank you, Mr. Schmitz. Thank you very much.
Cynthia, just a little comments on that. I think the COVID-19 crisis has demonstrated the capacities of the African economic zones to, let's say, to rethink their models and to be more and more resilient in the way that they develop their activities. And we've witnessed many good examples in different regions, in Ethiopia, in Morocco, in Ivory Coast, and in other regions, where economic zones have made the right decisions to allow companies that are located within the special economic zones to serve the needs of the domestic market. And I think resilience today is one of the challenges that we should take into considerations with considering, let's say, the globalization conditions and the way that business evolve today.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. And I think with that, we are coming towards the end of our panel discussion. I would really like to thank especially the panels for their time today, and also thank His Excellency Mr. Albert Muchanga for being with us and for hosting this whole event and giving us the opportunity today to discuss the special economic zones and how they can support Africa trades and invest and intra Africa trade, basically. So thank you very much. I think it's now, I'm not sure if Mr. Ahmed Benis would like to say, give a closing words.
I wanted to say that all of us today, we are celebrating the Africa Integration Day. So it's a big challenge to all of us. I mean, the one who lives in this continent, the one who work in this continent and work for this continent, and the ones that contribute to the wealth of this continent, we should realize today that we do have the competencies, we do have the capacities, and we have the energy today to face all the challenges. The way that we will recover from the COVID-19 is the best demonstration that Africa today can step in and be among the main player globally. So thank you again to our outstanding speakers who have shared their expertise. And I think it was a wonderful webinar session. We've had more than 300 followers. I mean, the one who participated on Zoom and the one who were following through Facebook. And we received many positive and good comments. And this will definitely push, again, our organizations, I mean, the Africa Economic Zone organization, to look forward and to follow up on this continuous support to our members and to the African Economic Zones community in general. Thank you, Cynthia, for the wonderful job that you have done today. You have done a great job. I mean, you were monitoring this webinar like a queen. You are a queen. You were the queen of today. Thank you to the panelists. You've done a wonderful job, and we hope to see you soon, and looking forward for the next webinar session. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I think Mrs. Bame Pilecho would like to say something from the African Union.
Yes, thank you so much, Cynthia. First of all, congratulations to the Africa Economic Zones organization for the great session that you have just completed. I would just like to share with the participants that the program for Africa Integration Day continues tomorrow. We have 4 sessions tomorrow. I hope you can see my screen. We will start off at 11 a.m. This is East African time. We start with a session on the role and contribution of agriculture to Africa's integration. That is being organized by the African Union Commission, Department of Rural Economy and Agriculture. This will be followed by a session at 1 o'clock. Hosted by Afrexim Bank on the introduction to the MANSA platform. This is a due diligence data platform that they have developed and will be showcasing. This will be followed by a session on the role of the African diaspora in harnessing the African continental free trade area in the context of COVID-19. And finally, we will have a very short closing session just to mark the end of the 9 days of celebration that we've just had. So I have posted the link for tomorrow's sessions in the chat platform. So if you'd like to access that before we close the session, would be very happy to see you tomorrow. And that is all from me. I look forward to all of you joining our sessions tomorrow, and have a great evening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Bame. Thank you all. Take care. Bye-bye.